Hi, I'm Phil Ashey from the American Anglican Council. We're continuing our introduction and orientation to the 2019 Book of Common Prayer. We're on the section called Special Liturgies of Lent and Holy Week. You know, sometimes when I'm talking with fellow believers from different traditions, they sometimes say things like, gosh, here we are, one Sunday it's Palm Sunday, and then the next it's Easter, and it's as if nothing's really changed. And yet everything changed when Jesus rose from the dead. But to understand that, you need to not only understand Resurrection Sunday, but you need to understand Good Friday. You need to understand Maundy Thursday, when he was celebrating that first Passover with his disciples. We need to understand going all the way back to Ash Wednesday, that period when he was in the desert facing Satan 40 days and 40 nights, which is why we observe Lent. We need to be able to have a service, like the Easter Vigil, that just takes us out of darkness and moves us immediately right into the light of the resurrection. So these liturgies help us mark time as Anglicans, help us to understand the full panoply, the picture of Jesus' life, his struggle against Satan, his death, and his resurrection. And in marking those times in these special liturgies, we too appreciate the fullness of Jesus' ministry to us. So let's listen in.
Some of the oldest liturgies that exist in the church come from the week leading up to Easter. And some of the oldest records that we have of liturgies being observed have to do with those days of Jesus' life after he enters into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry. The church observed those final days of his life from very, very early on. So we continue to do that with special liturgies.
Many of them were actually developed in Jerusalem around the practices of remembering and observing that week of Jesus' life in the centuries after. So you can see how a procession to the tomb of Jesus would kind of turn into a liturgical practice, and then that would have been taken over and adopted by other churches around the world.
These services especially go way back to the very first centuries of the church.
The Ash Wednesday service is the beginning of Lent, and so it's a day of fasting. It's one of the 2 days of fasting in the prayer book, the other being Good Friday. There are other days that are encouraged for acts of special devotion or abstinence, but Ash Wednesday and Good Friday are the two primary fasting days of the church. So it's a day in sort of starting off the season of Lent where we remember our mortality, we recall our sinfulness before God, and so the weakness of our moral nature and of our mortal nature, we bring both of those things before God in prayer and are reminded of His mercy.
One of my favorite sort of short sentences in the whole prayer book is what you say immediately before you impose ashes on people's foreheads. What the priest says to the congregation is, "Let us now call to mind our sin and the infinite mercy of God." And for me, that's kind of what church is. It's just this continuous calling to mind of our sin and the infinite mercy of God. And so we celebrate that in the sacraments, we proclaim it if we're preaching faithfully, we celebrate it in these special sorts of liturgies. That's certainly the flavor of the rest of Lent, our sin and the infinite mercy of God, and leading eventually to Easter. So Palm Sunday celebrates Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, kind of a little bit of an ironic term. It looks triumphal, of course, at first, and by the end of the service, we see his crucifixion on the horizon. And so, again, is one of the oldest liturgies remembered in the church, the sort of beginning of the final week of his life.
I like to call the Palm Sunday service liturgical whiplash because it begins with the triumphal entry of Christ into Jerusalem. So many churches will observe that with a procession and a reading of what's called the Palm Gospels. So there are actually two liturgical parts on Palm Sunday, the Palm Liturgy of the Palms, and then the normal liturgy. So the Liturgy of the Palms has the Palm Gospel in which Jesus triumphally enters Jerusalem, and the people are crying out, "Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And then by the time we've come to the Passion Gospel in the regular readings of the Eucharist for that day, the people are crying out, "Crucify him." So it's a day in which we remember both the royalty of Christ and the kingship of Christ and his kingdom, but also remember that his crown is a crown of thorns, and it's for that reason it's a very rich and very complex day liturgically. Maundy Thursday is the name given to the Thursday of Holy Week, to Holy Thursday. It's called Maundy Thursday because of the Latin word mandatum, or the way it's pronounced in English, mandate or command. And so it's the day on which we recall the commandment Christ gave to his disciples when he said, "A new commandment I give you, to love one another." It's a day that is also recognized as the day in which Christ instituted the Eucharist, and so we both commemorate it for Christ's command to love our neighbor, to love one another, and for his institution of the Holy Eucharist. Foot washing is often practiced on Maundy Thursday as a semblance of that love and service that Christ showed to his apostles.
And Maundy Thursday would begin the sort of 3 great days, the Triduum sometimes it's called, that lead us into Easter. And so you have Jesus institute Holy Communion with his disciples and show them to wash one another's feet. And then he goes out to the garden at Gethsemane and begins to pray there, and that sort of sets the trajectory for the rest of the time into Good Friday and eventually to Easter. Many churches will kind of strip their altars bare and kind of lay their sanctuaries to be very plain through that time, and sort of setting the scene for this kind of entering into mourning and into vigil holding for Jesus as he prays and goes to the cross. Good Friday is probably self-explanatory, I hope, to most Christians. This is when we would kind of pick up from where we left off on Maundy Thursday. You've had this kind of through the night vigil where you're praying and watching with Jesus, and he's arrested and brought to trial. And then, of course, on Good Friday, you gather and remember sort of the climax, or the beginning of the climax of our faith as Jesus is crucified. It often happens in many churches kind of from noon to 3. There's an important service that happens specifically to observe those hours that the scriptures tell us Jesus was hanged on the cross. So many churches will do their Good Friday liturgy during that time. Some will do it in the evening, but it's that midday is really when you sort of hold watch and stand and remember the cross.
Good Friday, beside being the second fast day declared in the prayer book, other than Ash Wednesday, it's also unique in that it is the one day on which celebrating a Eucharist is not permitted. It is, because it's a solemn day and a somber day, it's not permissible to celebrate a Eucharist on that day. Many churches will sanctify elements on Maundy Thursday and practice what's called communion from the reserved sacrament on Friday. But a complete celebration of the Eucharist is not allowed on that day. It's also a day on which devotional practices really proliferate. So there are a number of different local customs or traditions around Good Friday. Everything from services about the 7 last words of Christ, or Tenebrae, or Stations of the Cross, or what's called the Veneration of the Cross. Not all of these practices are found in the prayer book, but many of them are practiced devotionally in many different ways in the different churches.
So, and Holy Saturday would pick up from Good Friday, and it would actually be sort of a similar tone where you would not celebrate Holy Communion on Saturday. It's the day when Jesus would be understood to be kind of buried and either at rest, observing the Sabbath, or combating the forces of hell, kind of how you imagine that. But it kind of continues very much from the end of Good Friday, where Jesus' death has been declared. Holy Saturday is really just a vigil. There are some devotions provided in the prayer book, but it's not a day of great gathering or great pomp. It's a quiet and restful day. We imagine ourselves with Jesus' disciples who observed that Sabbath and waited until the sun rose before they went to the tomb. So Saturday is a very quiet day. You would not be celebrating Holy Communion. You wouldn't be doing much of anything ideally other than preparing yourself for Easter.
So that's true of Holy Saturday until we come to Saturday night, right? So the Easter Vigil is that movement from the solemnity and weight and heaviness of Good Friday and of Holy Saturday The Easter Vigil sort of begins at that point. It begins at a very dark point, but then moves gradually through readings recounting the history of salvation and of the expectation and promise of Christ's resurrection to the declaration of that resurrection itself, and to the first Alleluias of Easter, and the celebration that begins with Easter.
Beginning at sundown on Holy Saturday, we'd understand the next day to have begun, and so the Sabbath is over, and that's when observations of the Easter Vigil would begin to be observed, which, like David said, was sort of observed by like a large number of readings that would recount the whole span of the story of our redemption. That often happens in darkness with some psalms interspersed. Just before that, you would kindle a fire and light the Paschal candle, or the Easter candle, from which all the rest of the lights would be lit. So that's a quiet part of the service, and then you transition into the main service when you do kind of say Alleluia. Baptismal vows would be remembered at that point. If there are baptisms to celebrate, they would be baptized. And then kind of following the custom of the church, those newly baptized folks, especially if they're adults, would be welcomed into Holy Communion and sort of the great celebration, the great feast of Easter, which then would continue for 50 days thereafter.